My best friend's situationship texted me and said, if her boobs were as big as yours, she'd be perfect. So I confronted him, and I discovered they'd been playing me for months. I was sitting in my living room, texting Chuck about Amelie's birthday next week. My best friend had been obsessing over this guy for 3 months, analyzing every text, every emoji, every hour between responses, and I was determined to help her lock it down. She mentioned she loves that Italian place downtown. I texted him. Just saying, would be perfect for her birthday dinner. Good to know, he replied. I was in full wingwoman mode. She's been so happy lately, BTW. She really likes you, Chuck. Like, really likes you. Yeah? 100%. She literally glows when she talks about you. And she's already planning to introduce you to her parents at graduation. You got a good one. I smiled, thinking about how excited Amelie would be if he actually planned something romantic. She deserved this. I was typing another message about her favorite flowers when his next text came through. There's just one thing, though. My stomach was turning now. Chuck, what are you talking about? Don't get me wrong, she's pretty. Just usually I go for girls who are more curvy. I felt uncomfortable, but tried to stay positive. Chuck, Amelie is beautiful. If you don't see that dash. But I never even got to send my message, because that's when he said it. If her boobs were as big as yours, she'd be perfect. I read it 3 times. My hands started shaking. This couldn't be real. I screenshotted it immediately, my mind racing. Amelie had been my best friend since freshman year. We'd been through everything together, bad breakups, family drama, failed classes, and I'd just been hyping her up to this piece of trash who was, comparing our bodies like we were items on a menu. Another text popped up. I know you're reading this. Then, don't act like you haven't noticed me looking. My skin crawled. I thought about all the times he'd hung out with us as a group. Those moments I'd caught his eyes lingering. I'd convinced myself I was imagining it. Amelie was gorgeous. Why would he be looking at me? I started typing to Amelie, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted. How do you tell your best friend that the guy she's falling for just said something this disgusting? We need to talk. This isn't okay. I texted him back. My place. 20 minutes. Or I tell Amelie you've been flirting with me. The threat made my blood boil. I hadn't done anything. But then I remembered last weekend, Amelie had made a weird comment when I'd laughed at his joke. You two seem really friendly lately, she'd said, her voice flat. So I threw on the crustiest hoodie I could find, period-stained sweats from the Dollar Tree, and drove to his apartment complex, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I needed to set this straight. Amelie deserved to know who this guy really was. He opened the door before I could knock, wearing that stupid smirk he always had. Knew you'd come. You're sick, I said, pushing past him. Amelie trusts you. She's falling for you. Is she, though? He closed the door behind me, leaning against it. She seems more worried about you and me than anything else lately. Because you're making her insecure. You're probably checking me out in front of her. He stepped closer. I backed up, but hit the wall. Can you blame me? His hand reached out, and before I could react, he was gripping my waist, pulling me against him. She's cute, but you're... I shoved him hard, breaking free. Don't touch me! I'm telling Amelie everything. His expression darkened. No, you're not. He pulled out his phone, showing me texts from Amelie. My blood ran cold as I read them. She'd been venting to him, about me, how I always dressed up when he was around, how I monopolized his attention at parties, how she felt like she was competing with her own best friend. She already thinks you want me, he said, that sick smile returning. I've been the good boyfriend, defending you, telling her she's paranoid. But one word from me about how you came on to me tonight, how you showed up at my apartment, he gestured at the scene. Who do you think she'll believe? My phone buzzed. It was Amelie. Where are you? Chuck said you might come by to talk to him about something. What's going on? I stared at the message. He'd already started covering his tracks. You're disgusting, I whispered. I'm realistic, he said. Amelie's fun, but we both know there's something between us. Stop fighting it. I practically ran out of his apartment, my whole body shaking with rage and disgust. As I sat in my car, another text from him appeared. Check Amelie's Instagram story. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Posted 5 minutes ago. A selfie of them together from earlier that day. Amelie was beaming, his arm around her. The caption read, so grateful for this one. Can't believe I almost let my insecurities ruin this. The next text wasn't from Chuck. It was from Amelie. I know what he did. I know about the text. Come over. Now. My blood turned to ice. I started my car with shaking hands and pulled out of Chuck's parking lot. My phone sat in the cup holder with Amelie's text glowing on the screen. The drive to her apartment took 12 minutes but felt like hours. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd explain showing up at Chuck's place, how I'd defend myself against whatever he'd already told her. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When I pulled up to her building, I sat in the car for 30 seconds trying to calm my breathing. I climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment and raised my hand to knock, but the door opened before I could. Amelie stood there in sweatpants and an old hoodie, her hair pulled back. Her expression wasn't what I expected. She wasn't crying or angry. She looked determined, maybe a little sad, but not surprised. She stepped back to let me in without saying anything. I walked past her into the living room where her laptop sat open on the coffee table. Before I could start explaining, Amelie picked up her phone and held it out to me. The screen showed a long thread of screenshots. I took the phone and started scrolling. These were conversations between me and Chuck, but they looked wrong. Text messages I'd sent were there, but the ones before and after were different from I remembered. In one screenshot, I'd texted Chuck about meeting up for coffee, something innocent about coordinating a group hangout. But in his version that he'd shown Emily, my message appeared right after he'd said something flirty, making it look like I was responding to his advance. Another screenshot showed me complimenting his shirt at a party. Normal friendly stuff. But Chuck had told Emily it happened right after I'd supposedly asked if he was single. The timestamps were edited. The context was twisted. Everything looked suspicious when you saw it through Chuck's carefully arranged lens. I scrolled back further and found weeks of this. My stomach turned. Emily sat down on the couch and gestured for me to sit next to her. I sank down, still staring at her phone. She reached over and took it back, then pulled up another folder of screenshots. These were from her conversations with Chuck. Time-stamped, organized by date. She'd been documenting everything. I looked at her and she met my eyes. She told me she'd known for 2 weeks that something was wrong. Chuck had started making little comments about me, suggesting I dressed up when he was around, that I laughed too hard at his jokes. At first, Emily thought she was being paranoid, but then she started paying attention to what actually happened versus what Chuck claimed happened later. The stories didn't match. She'd started screenshotting every conversation with him, every text, every social media interaction. When Chuck would tell her something I'd supposedly said or done, she'd go back and check her records. The inconsistencies were everywhere. She showed me one example from last week. Chuck had told her I'd texted him privately asking about his relationship status. I'd never sent that text. Emily knew because she'd asked to see his phone that night, claiming she wanted to look at a funny meme he'd mentioned. She'd quickly scrolled through his messages with me. The text he claimed I'd sent didn't exist. That's when she knew for sure he was lying. My hands were shaking as I held her phone. I felt sick thinking about how thoroughly Chuck had manipulated both of us. But underneath the nausea was this huge wave of relief. Emily had never actually doubted our friendship. She'd been playing along, pretending to be the jealous girlfriend Chuck wanted her to be, while she gathered proof. She'd been protecting us both by documenting his lies. I looked at her and saw my best friend, the person who'd known me since freshman year, who'd been strategic enough to build a case instead of just reacting emotionally. Emily pulled up another set of screenshots. These were from 3 days ago. Chuck had texted her saying I'd been asking questions about whether they were official yet. He'd said I'd mentioned I thought he could do better. He'd told her I'd seemed really interested in knowing if he was happy. I'd never said any of that, not even close. The actual conversation I'd had with Chuck 3 days ago was about Emily's birthday dinner plans. That was it. Just me trying to help coordinate something nice for my best friend. But in Chuck's version to Emily, he'd twisted my wingwoman efforts into evidence that I wanted him for myself. We sat there for the next 2 hours going through everything. Emily pulled out her laptop and we opened our text histories with Chuck side by side. She had a notebook where she'd been tracking the lies. We found the pattern immediately. Chuck would tell me that Emily said something she never said. He'd tell Emily that I did something I never did. He'd take real conversations and edit them in his retellings, adding context that made innocent interactions look suspicious. In one case, he'd told Emily I'd touched his arm while talking to him at a party. What actually happened was, I'd tapped his shoulder to get his attention in a loud room. Chuck had been systematically lying to both of us for months, creating a false narrative where we were competing for him. The documentation was damning. Every lie was there in black and white, time-stamped and preserved. I finally told Emily about tonight, about Chuck's disgusting text comparing our bodies, about driving to his apartment to confront him, about how he'd backed me against the wall and grabbed my waist. Her jaw clenched when I described that part. I showed her the screenshots I'd taken of his messages. She added them to her evidence folder without saying anything. Then I told her about how Chuck had shown me texts where she'd been venting about me, how he'd threatened to tell her I came on to him, how he'd already texted her that I was coming over before I even arrived. Emily closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she told me she'd suspected he was capable of something like this. That's why she'd started documenting everything 2 weeks ago. She'd needed proof before she could accuse him because she knew exactly what he'd do. He'd flip it around. He'd make himself the victim. He'd claim we were crazy or jealous or lying. Without evidence, it would be his word against ours, and he'd already spent months making both of us look unstable to each other. She'd needed the screenshots to prove the pattern. We sat in silence for a minute, both of us processing how calculated Chuck's manipulation had been. Then Emily said we weren't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to let him do this to other women. She suggested we needed to find out if he'd done this before. If there were other women who'd experienced his manipulation and gaslighting. I thought about all the times Chuck had mentioned his ex. He'd always painted her as crazy, obsessed, couldn't let go. Red flags everywhere according to him. Her name was Liana. Emily looked at me and said something that made everything click into place. Guys who manipulate women always call their exes crazy. It's part of the pattern. They rewrite history to make themselves look like victims. I pulled out my phone and started searching. I typed Chuck's name into Instagram and scrolled through his followers until I found her profile picture from one of his old tagged photos. Liana Gregory. Her account was public, filled with pictures of her hiking and hanging out with friends, who all looked genuinely happy to be around her. Not the obsessed stalker ex Chuck had described at all. Emily leaned over my shoulder and stared at the screen. We sat there for a minute, both of us knowing what we needed to do. but neither wanting to be the one to say it first. Finally, Emily broke the silence and said we should message her. I felt weird about it, though. Like, who randomly contacts their situationship's ex out of nowhere? That seemed like something a crazy person would do. But then I thought about Chuck's texts again, about how he'd backed me against a wall tonight, about all the lies he'd told both of us. Emily pointed out that if Leanna really was as unstable as Chuck claimed, she probably wouldn't respond anyway. And if she did respond, that would tell us something important about whether Chuck was lying about her too. I opened a new message and started typing, then deleted it. Started again. The message needed to sound normal, not accusatory or weird. I wrote that Emily and I were trying to understand some things about Chuck's behavior, and we were hoping she might be willing to talk to us about her experience with him. I kept it short and factual, just asking if she'd be open to a conversation. My finger hung over the send button for a solid 30 seconds before I finally pressed it. Emily and I both stared at my phone like it might explode. I set it face down on the coffee table and tried not to think about it, but my brain kept spinning through all the possible responses. Maybe Leanna would think we were insane. Maybe she'd screenshot our message and send it to Chuck. Maybe she'd block us without responding. My phone buzzed exactly 18 minutes later. I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it. The message preview made my stomach flip. Leanna had written back saying, "Oh my God, finally," and asking if we could video chat right now. Right now. Not tomorrow, not later this week. Right now. I showed Emily the message and watched her eyes go wide. That immediate response told us everything we needed to know before we even got on the call. Leanna had been waiting for someone to reach out. She'd been waiting for someone to believe her. I sent back my video chat info, and within 2 minutes, my phone was ringing. Leanna's face appeared on screen, and she looked nothing like the crazy ex Chuck had described. She looked tired and relieved and maybe a little bit angry. She didn't waste time with small talk. She jumped straight into describing how Chuck had isolated her from her 3 closest friends over the course of 6 months. He'd told her that her best friend Joyce was flirting with him at parties. He'd said her roommate kept texting him inappropriate things. He'd claimed her friend from work had tried to kiss him when Leanna wasn't around. None of it was true, but Leanna hadn't known that at the time. She'd confronted each friend, started arguments, pushed them away. By the time she realized Chuck was lying, those friendships were already destroyed. Joyce had blocked her number. Her roommate had moved out. Her work friend had transferred to a different department to avoid her. Emily and I sat frozen, listening to Leanna describe a pattern that felt sickeningly familiar. The way Chuck would take real interactions and twist them just enough to make them look suspicious. The way he'd position himself as the reasonable one, the one trying to keep the peace while everyone else was being dramatic. The way he'd make Leanna feel like she was competing with her own friends for his attention. I asked if she still had any of the messages from back then. Leanna's face lit up in this grim way, and she said she'd kept everything. She switched to screen sharing and started pulling up screenshots from 2 years ago. The messages were almost identical to what Chuck had been sending us. The same manipulation tactics, the same gaslighting language, like he was reading from a script. In one screenshot, Chuck told Leanna that her friend Joyce had touched his arm while talking to him, and it made him uncomfortable. The exact same lie he'd told Emily about me. In another, he said Joyce kept finding excuses to be alone with him. Leanna scrolled through dozens of messages, each one showing Chuck systematically destroying her friendships, while pretending to be the victim. Emily grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. We were both shaking. Leanna stopped scrolling and looked directly at the camera. She said there were 2 other women she knew of who'd had similar experiences with Chuck. One was a girl named Danielle who Chuck had dated briefly last year. The other was someone Danielle knew through mutual friends. Leanna offered to reach out to both of them right now and see if they'd be willing to share their stories. I told her yes before she even finished the sentence. Leanna said she'd create a group chat and add everyone. She disappeared from the video call and my phone immediately started buzzing with notifications. New group chat. Leanna added Danielle. Danielle added someone named Nova. Within an hour, we had 5 women total in this chat, all comparing notes on Chuck's behavior. The consistency was terrifying and validating at the same time. Every single woman described the same pattern. Chuck would target close female friendships and try to destroy them by making each woman think the other was a threat. He'd tell woman A that woman B was flirting with him. He'd tell woman B that woman A was jealous and possessive. He'd create drama and competition where none existed before. Danielle sent a screenshot that made my blood run cold. It was a text from Chuck to her roommate saying if her boobs were as big as yours, she'd be perfect. The exact same line, word for word. Danielle said Chuck had used that line to create jealousy between her and her roommate, making them both feel insecure and competitive. It was apparently his go-to move, his standard play from whatever sick playbook he followed. I felt like I might throw up. This wasn't just normal dating drama or a guy being a jerk. This was calculated and deliberate. Chuck specifically targeted close female friendships because destroying those bonds gave him power and control. He fed off the drama and the competition. He enjoyed watching women who loved each other turn against each other over him. Emily's voice cut through my thoughts. She said we needed to compile all our evidence into one document. Everything we had on Chuck's pattern of manipulation and gaslighting. Screenshots, timelines, testimonies from all 5 of us. The other women in the chat immediately agreed. Danielle said she'd start organizing her screenshots by date. Nova offered to write out a detailed timeline of her experience. Leanna said she'd create a shared document where we could all add our evidence. I looked at Emily and saw the same determination in her eyes that I felt building in my chest. Chuck had spent months, maybe years, destroying women's friendships for his own entertainment. But now we had proof. Now we had each other. And we weren't going to let him get away with it anymore. The next morning, I woke up with my laptop already open and started creating folders for each woman's evidence. I named them by date ranges so we could see the timeline clearly. Leanna's screenshots went back to 2021, showing Chuck using the exact same tactics with her roommate that he'd tried on me and Emily. Danielle's messages were from last spring when he'd dated her briefly, while texting her best friend behind her back. The other two women had similar stories from different time periods. I spent hours organizing everything into one master document with sections for each relationship he'd ruined. The pattern was so obvious once you saw it all laid out together. He always targeted women who were close friends. He always made comments about their bodies to create insecurity. He always played them against each other by lying about what each one said. By noon, I had a 15-page document with screenshots, dates, and written statements from all 5 of us. My phone buzzed with a text from Chuck and my stomach turned before I even opened it. He was asking why I ran away last night and if I wanted to talk about what almost happened between us. The gaslighting was so clear now that I could see his whole playbook. He was trying to rewrite what actually happened in his apartment, making it sound like there was some mutual attraction instead of him cornering me against a wall. I immediately took a screenshot of his message and added it to page 16 of our evidence document. Emily called me right after and I told her about the text. She said I should respond to him but keep it neutral, act like his manipulation was still working, so he wouldn't know we were preparing our next move. I typed back something vague about needing space to think, and he responded with a heart emoji that made my skin crawl. An hour later, Nova texted me asking if something happened with Chuck, because he'd been posting weird stuff on social media about fake friends and jealous girls. I felt my chest get tight because this meant his preemptive strike had already started. He was trying to control the narrative before we could tell anyone the truth. I told Nova I could explain everything and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. She said yes, and we agreed to meet at the campus Starbucks in an hour. I grabbed my laptop with all the evidence saved and drove over there early. Nova showed up looking confused and a little worried. We got our drinks and sat in the back corner where no one could hear us. I started by showing her just some of the evidence. Not everything yet, because I wanted to see her reaction first. I pulled up the text where Chuck made that comment about my body and told her the whole story about what happened at his apartment. Nova's face changed while she read it, but then she said Chuck had always seemed like such a nice guy to their friend group. I could tell she was skeptical, like maybe I was overreacting or misunderstanding his intentions. Then I showed her messages from Leanna and Danielle describing almost identical situations. Nova went quiet and scrolled through the screenshots for a long time. She finally looked up at me and admitted that Chuck had complained to her last week about Emily being possessive and me being inappropriate around him. She said he'd told her I was always dressing up when he came over and that Emily was getting jealous of our friendship. Nova was starting to see how he'd been planting seeds with everyone in our friend group, making us look bad before we could defend ourselves. She apologized for doubting me at first and said the pattern was undeniable once you saw it all together. That night, Chuck posted on social media about knowing your real friends and people who smile to your face but stab you in the back. Several mutual friends commented with supportive messages telling him to stay strong and cut off toxic people. My hands were shaking reading the comments because none of them knew what he'd actually done. They thought he was the victim in some friend drama, when really he was a manipulator trying to isolate us. Emily came over to my apartment and we sat on my bed looking at Chuck's post together. We decided we needed to get ahead of his narrative before he poisoned our entire social circle against us. Our plan was to share the evidence with close friends first, one by one, so they'd know the truth before Chuck could twist it. The next day, I met with 2 friends from my dorm, Sarah and Maya, and walked them through the whole timeline of Chuck's manipulation. I showed them the document with all 15 pages of evidence and watched their faces change as they scrolled through it. They were shocked, but they believed me, especially when they saw messages from the other women describing the same exact pattern. Sarah said she'd noticed Chuck making weird comments about female friendships before, but she'd thought it was just him being awkward. Maya remembered a time when Chuck had told her that Emily seemed really jealous and controlling, which now made sense as part of his manipulation strategy. They both promised to help spread the truth to other people in our friend group. That same night, Chuck apparently noticed people were acting different around him because he texted Emily asking if I'd been spreading lies about him. Emily responded calmly saying she just wanted to talk in person about some things. Her response was perfect because it didn't give anything away, but also didn't let him think he was getting away with it. I could tell Chuck was getting nervous because he sent 3 more texts in a row asking what she wanted to talk about and saying he could explain everything. Emily left him on read and texted me instead saying his desperation was showing. The next day, we picked a coffee shop near campus with big windows and lots of people around. Emily texted Chuck saying she wanted to talk and he agreed to meet at 2 o'clock. I got there 30 minutes early and sat at a corner table where I could see everything, but wasn't obviously with Emily. My leg bounced under the table as I watched the door and sipped a coffee I didn't actually want. Emily walked in at exactly 2, looking calm and put together in a way that made me proud and nervous at the same time. She ordered a drink and sat at a table in the middle of the shop, her phone face down in front of her. Chuck showed up 5 minutes late, that usual confident walk like he owned every room he entered. He slid into the chair across from Emily and I watched him lean in with that smile, probably thinking he was about to smooth everything over. Emily's voice was quiet, but I could see her lips moving as she spoke. She kept her hands folded on the table, not touching him. Her whole body language different from how she used to be around him. I saw Chuck's expression shift from confident to confused as she talked. His hand reached across the table toward hers, but she pulled back slightly. That's when I knew she was telling him about the text and the pattern we'd found. Chuck's face changed completely and he started talking fast, his hands moving in those big gestures guys do when they're trying to convince you of something. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew exactly what was happening because Amelie had warned me he'd try to flip it around. He pointed at his chest a few times, then gestured toward the door like he was talking about me. Amelie just sat there listening with this completely neutral expression that must have been driving him crazy, because he was used to her reacting and getting emotional. Then she did the most perfect thing. She picked up her phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table to him. I watched Chuck's face as he looked at the screen and saw everything we'd compiled. His confident expression cracked, and for a second he just stared at the phone. He tried to push it back to her, but she shook her head and said something while pointing at the screen. He looked again, and I could see his jaw tighten as he scrolled through page after page of evidence. The screenshots from 5 different women, the timeline showing his pattern, the messages where he'd said nearly identical things to multiple people. His whole body language changed and he slumped back in his chair. He started talking again, but this time his hands were up in a defensive way, palms out like he was trying to calm someone down. Amelie leaned forward and said something short. Chuck's expression went from apologetic to something darker, and he leaned in close to her face. I tensed up, ready to walk over, but Amelie didn't move. She just stared at him until he sat back. Then she stood up, picked up her phone, and walked out without looking back. Chuck sat there for a minute, looking stunned before he got up and left in the opposite direction. I waited 5 minutes before leaving and met Amelie at her car 2 blocks away. She was shaking, but she smiled when she saw me. That night, I was lying in bed scrolling through social media when Chuck's post appeared at the top of my feed. It was long, probably 500 words about how hard it is to be a good guy in today's world, where women team up and make false accusations. He talked about toxic femininity and how some women can't handle rejection, so they create stories to ruin men's lives. The comments started rolling in immediately. People from our classes and mutual friends saying they were sorry he was going through this and that they believed him. My stomach turned reading the supportive messages from people who had no idea what he'd actually done. 3 people messaged me within an hour asking what happened and if I was okay. They said Chuck had been texting them privately, saying I'd tried to kiss him at his apartment, and that Amelie was just defending me because she didn't want to believe her best friend would do that. His version was spreading through our friend group faster than we could counter it. I screenshot every message and added them to our evidence document. Nova's text came through at almost midnight and my hands were shaking as I read it. She said Chuck told her I'd been flirting with him for weeks, and that I showed up at his apartment alone at night trying to start something. She said Amelie was in denial and just taking my side because we're best friends. The text ended with her asking if I wanted to explain what really happened. I didn't even respond with words, just sent her the link to the full evidence document we'd put together. I watched the 3 dots appear and disappear on my screen for almost 10 minutes as she read through everything. The dots would show up for a while, then vanish, then come back. I could picture her scrolling through page after page of screenshots and testimonies from 5 different women. My phone rang 20 minutes later and Nova was crying before I even said hello. She kept apologizing and saying she felt stupid for believing him at first. She said Chuck had seemed so convincing when he talked to her, so hurt and confused about why we were attacking him. She said she should have known better than to take his word without hearing our side. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Chuck was good at this because he'd been doing it for years. Nova asked what we were planning to do next because she said Chuck's narrative was taking over, and people were starting to choose sides without knowing the truth. She suggested we organize a gathering at her apartment where we could present everything to our core friend group all at once, instead of trying to defend ourselves to people one by one. I loved the idea immediately because it meant we could control the narrative instead of constantly playing defense. The next few days were weird because I could feel the social dynamics shifting. Some people who used to say hi in the hallway would look away when they saw me. Others would stop me and ask quiet questions about what was going on with Chuck. Chuck's social media activity went into overdrive with posts about cancel culture and mob mentality every few hours. He shared articles about false accusations and how men's lives get destroyed by jealous women. Each post got dozens of supportive comments from people who didn't know the full story. But I also started noticing some people quietly unfollowing him or removing their supportive comments after they saw our evidence. Sarah told me she'd shown the document to 3 other people from our study group, and they were all disturbed by the pattern. Maya said 2 guys from Chuck's fraternity had reached out asking if the stuff about him was true because they'd noticed him being weird about their girlfriends. The cracks in Chuck's story were starting to show as more people actually looked at the evidence instead of just believing his victim act. 2 days later, Amelie got a message from Stuart asking if they could talk. She showed me the text, and we both stared at it for a minute because Stuart had always seemed pretty quiet and uninvolved in Chuck's drama. He said he'd witnessed some stuff that made him uncomfortable and felt like we should know about it. Amelie texted back asking if he could meet us at the coffee shop near campus in an hour. When we got there, Stuart was already sitting at a corner table looking nervous and fidgeting with his phone. He barely made eye contact as we sat down. He started by apologizing for not saying anything sooner, then told us he'd been hearing Chuck practice conversations in their apartment for weeks. He said Chuck would pace around their living room rehearsing what to say to different people. trying out different versions of stories to see which sounded more believable. Stuart pulled out his phone and showed us notes he'd taken with dates and times of these practice sessions. The detail was incredible and kind of disturbing because it proved Chuck was planning his manipulation instead of just reacting to situations. Stuart said the worst part came 3 days ago when he walked in on Chuck typing something on his phone with this focused expression. Chuck quickly closed the app, but Stuart had already seen enough to know it was some kind of document. That night when Chuck was in the shower, Stuart looked at his phone and found a Notes app file titled with just a random string of numbers. He opened it and his stomach turned. The document was pages long with different women's names at the top of each section. Under each name, Chuck had listed personal information, insecurities he'd noticed, things they'd told him in confidence, and specific phrases or approaches he planned to use with them. There were notes about me and Amelie going back months. Under my name, he'd written things like, insecure about being threatening to other women, and responds well to compliments about appearance. Under Amelie's name, he had jealous of female friendships, and needs constant reassurance. Stuart took photos of the entire document before Chuck got out of the shower. He showed us the screenshots, and I felt sick reading through Chuck's clinical analysis of how to manipulate us. There were entries for Leanna and Danielle too, plus 3 other women we didn't know. Each section had dates and notes about what worked and what didn't work in conversations. It was like reading a predator's hunting manual. The planning and calculation behind everything Chuck had done suddenly became real in a way that made my hands shake. Amelie asked Stuart why he was coming forward now, and he said he couldn't keep pretending he didn't know what his roommate was doing to people. He said he'd been making excuses for Chuck in his head, but seeing that document made it impossible to ignore anymore. I started seeing a campus counselor the next week because I couldn't sleep, and my anxiety was getting worse every day. Walking across campus felt exhausting, because I kept wondering who believed Chuck's lies about me and who had seen our evidence. The counselor's office was in the health center and smelled like lavender, which normally I hate, but somehow made me feel calmer. The counselor listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned forward and said what Chuck did was emotional abuse and gaslighting. Hearing a professional validate that this wasn't just normal dating drama or a misunderstanding made me cry in a way I hadn't let myself cry since this whole thing started. She said manipulators like Chuck specifically target people's insecurities and use them as weapons. She explained that the stress I was feeling was a normal response to sustained psychological manipulation and betrayal. We talked about setting boundaries and recognizing red flags in future relationships. She gave me some techniques for managing anxiety when I felt overwhelmed by Chuck's smear campaign. Just having someone outside the situation confirm that I wasn't overreacting or being dramatic helped more than I expected. That same week, Leanna posted her own story on social media without naming Chuck but describing the manipulation pattern in detail. She wrote about how someone she dated had systematically destroyed her friendships by making her think her friends wanted him. She described the isolation and self-doubt that came from constantly second-guessing her own perceptions. She talked about finding out later that he'd used the same tactics on multiple women. The post got shared dozens of times within hours. The comment section filled up with other women sharing similar experiences. Some were clearly about Chuck based on the timeline and details. Others were about different guys but showed the same pattern of manipulation. 3 women I didn't know commented saying they'd had experiences with someone matching Leanna's description and asked if they could message her privately. Maya shared the post with a comment about believing women and recognizing manipulation tactics. Sarah added her own comment about how men who do this always call their exes crazy. I watched Chuck's social media presence change over the next few days as his narrative started falling apart. People who'd commented support on his posts about cancel culture began quietly deleting their comments. Some unfollowed him completely. His posts got fewer and fewer likes. The friends who'd been defending him in group chats went silent. Nova told me she'd had 5 different people reach out, asking if the stuff about Chuck was true because they'd started seeing the pattern once they looked for it. 2 guys from his study group said they'd noticed him making weird comments about their girlfriends that they'd brushed off at the time. Someone from his fraternity said Chuck had tried to convince him his girlfriend was flirting with other guys when she definitely wasn't. The comparison of notes happening across our social circle made Chuck's manipulation obvious to everyone who bothered to actually look at the evidence instead of just believing his victim act. Nova called me and Emily suggesting we organize a gathering at her apartment where we could present everything to our core friend group all at once. She said about 12 people needed to hear the full story with all the evidence laid out properly, instead of getting bits and pieces through the rumor mill. We agreed immediately because it meant controlling the narrative instead of constantly defending ourselves to individuals. We spent 2 days preparing a presentation on Nova's laptop with a timeline of Chuck's manipulation and evidence from all 5 women. We organized the screenshots chronologically so people could see the pattern develop over years. We included Stuart's photos of the Notes app document and his testimony about the practiced conversations. The night before the gathering, Chuck sent me a message that made my skin crawl. He said he'd tell everyone the truth about what really happened if I agreed to let this whole thing go. He said we could both move on and nobody else had to get hurt by this drama. I screenshotted it immediately and sent it to Amelie and Nova. The desperation in his message was obvious and pathetic. He was trying one last manipulation attempt to avoid facing consequences. I added the screenshot to our evidence folder with a note about the timing. His offer to tell the truth only when backed into a corner showed he knew exactly what he'd done and was just trying to escape accountability. At Nova's apartment the next evening, 12 people crowded into her living room, sitting on couches, chairs, and the floor. Emily and I stood near the TV where we'd pulled up our presentation. The room got quiet as we started walking through the timeline. We showed Chuck's initial messages to me about Emily's body. We showed how he'd been feeding Emily edited versions of our conversations to make her jealous. We showed Leanna's evidence from 2 years ago with nearly identical manipulation tactics. We showed Danielle's screenshots and the 3 other women's testimonies. We showed Stuart's photos of the Notes app document with Chuck's calculated plans for manipulating each of us. People scrolled through the evidence on their phones as we talked. Nobody said anything, but I could see their expressions changing as they realized how extensive and deliberate Chuck's manipulation had been. Sarah kept shaking her head. Maya had tears in her eyes. The 2 guys from Chuck's study group looked angry. About halfway through our presentation, there was a knock on Nova's door. She opened it and Chuck walked in uninvited, saying he had a right to defend himself against these accusations. The room went tense immediately. Chuck started talking about how we were taking things out of context and that he'd made some mistakes, but we were blowing everything out of proportion. He said the Notes app was just him processing his feelings and that everyone keeps private notes about their relationships. He said we were trying to destroy his reputation because Emily was jealous, and I was bitter that he'd rejected me. Stuart stood up from where he'd been sitting on the floor. He looked at Chuck and said he'd heard him practicing these exact denials in their apartment last night. He told the group about the rehearsed conversations he'd witnessed for weeks. He described walking in on Chuck typing the Notes app document and finding pages of calculated manipulation strategies. He said Chuck had specifically planned how to make Emily jealous of me and how to make me feel like I was threatening their relationship. Stuart's testimony coming from Chuck's own roommate completely destroyed whatever defense Chuck had tried to mount. One by one, people in the room started speaking up about moments they'd dismissed before. Maya said Chuck had told her I dressed provocatively around him and seemed interested. One of the study group guys said Chuck had made a weird comment about his girlfriend being too friendly with other men. Sarah remembered Chuck suggesting Emily was obsessed with him in an unhealthy way. Another friend brought up how Chuck had called his ex Leanna crazy and obsessed when they'd asked about her. Each person's story added another piece to the pattern until it became impossible to see Chuck's behavior as anything other than deliberate manipulation of multiple women over years. The room full of people who'd known Chuck for months or years all saw the truth at the same time, and his power to control the narrative evaporated completely. Chuck grabbed his jacket and walked out of Nova's apartment without saying another word. I watched through the window as Sarah and 2 guys from his study group followed him into the parking lot. They weren't leaving with him as support. They were making sure he understood he wasn't welcome at future hangouts. Sarah's arms were crossed and she was shaking her head while one of the guys pointed back toward the apartment building. Chuck got in his car and drove off alone. The next week felt like watching dominoes fall. Maya told 3 people from her sorority what happened. Those 3 people told their friends. Stuart posted a vague story on social media about recognizing manipulation tactics, and several people commented asking what happened. He didn't name Chuck directly, but everyone in our social circle knew exactly who he meant. Chuck stopped showing up to the usual coffee shop where our group studied on Tuesday nights. He didn't come to the campus bar on Friday. By the following Monday, he'd blocked most of our mutual friends on Instagram and Twitter. His last post before going private was some quote about fake friends and loyalty that got 0 likes. My phone buzzed with a group chat notification. Danielle had sent a screenshot to our group with all the women Chuck had manipulated. The message showed Chuck trying to apologize to her through Instagram DMs. He claimed he'd been going through a rough time and made some mistakes, but we were all blowing things out of proportion. He said he hoped she could forgive him, and maybe they could talk. Danielle responded in the group chat that she'd blocked him immediately, and wanted to warn us he might try reaching out to others looking for sympathy. Leanna confirmed she'd gotten a similar message that morning. I checked my message requests and found nothing, which probably meant he knew I wouldn't respond anyway. Emily came over to my apartment that Thursday night with takeout, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. She sat cross-legged on my bed picking at her pad thai, while explaining how Chuck had made her feel inadequate about her appearance from the start. He'd made little comments about other women being curvy or having nice bodies, never directly insulting her but always planting seeds of comparison. She'd started wearing push-up bras around him and considering getting work done even though she'd never cared about that stuff before. The manipulation had been so slow and steady that she didn't realize it was happening until she started documenting everything. I told her about my own stuff, about how I'd spent years feeling like I was somehow threatening to other women's relationships just by existing, how I'd started dressing down around couples and trying to make myself smaller and less noticeable, how Chuck had weaponized that exact insecurity by making me think Emily saw me as competition. We talked about how he'd taken normal feelings that everyone has sometimes and twisted them into tools for control. He'd found our weak spots and pressed on them over and over until we started doubting ourselves and each other. Emily grabbed my hand and made me look at her. She said our friendship surviving Chuck's attempts to destroy it proved it was real in a way that actually meant something. We made a pact right there to communicate directly with each other from now on, instead of letting anyone play us against each other again. If either of us felt weird about something the other did, we'd talk about it immediately instead of letting it fester. No more assuming, no more letting other people interpret our actions for us. Nova started hanging out with us more after everything came out. She told me over coffee that she'd learned her own lesson about believing manipulative people just because they seemed charming on the surface. Chuck had been so good at playing the nice guy that she'd almost dismissed our evidence as some kind of misunderstanding. Now she was paying attention to red flags in our social circle and calling out concerning behavior when she saw it. Last weekend, she'd shut down a guy at a party who was talking about his girlfriend in ways that reminded her of how Chuck used to talk about Emily. I kept going to my therapy appointments at the campus counseling center. The counselor helped me work through my trust issues around men and friendships. We talked about recognizing manipulation tactics early, about trusting my gut when something felt off, about not dismissing my own discomfort to keep the peace. She gave me a list of red flags to watch for in future relationships, things like love bombing, isolation from friends, gaslighting, and triangulation. I realized Chuck had checked almost every box on that list. The sessions helped me understand that what happened wasn't my fault, and that I could protect myself better going forward without becoming paranoid or closed off to everyone. 3 weeks after everything came out, Emily's birthday finally arrived. We celebrated at that Italian place downtown she'd mentioned to Chuck months ago, the one he never took her to. Our group filled 2 tables, all real friends who'd believed us and supported us through the drama. Nova sat next to me making jokes about the wine list. Stuart brought Emily a plant as a gift because she'd mentioned wanting to start a little garden on her balcony. Leanna and Danielle came too, having become part of our extended friend group through our shared experience with Chuck. Someone made a joke about starting a support group for survivors of Chuck's manipulation, and we all laughed harder than we probably should have. At dinner, Emily stood up with her wine glass and got everyone's attention. She thanked me specifically for being honest with her about Chuck's comment, instead of hiding it or trying to handle it alone. She said me screenshotting that message and bringing it to her attention had probably saved her from months more of manipulation and gaslighting. She said our friendship surviving this whole mess proved it was real in a way that felt really meaningful, that we'd been tested in the worst possible way and came out stronger. Everyone at the table raised their glasses, and I felt my eyes getting wet, but in a good way this time. Maya squeezed my shoulder and Nova smiled at me from across the table. For the first time in weeks, I felt like everything was actually going to be okay. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had people around me who genuinely cared and who I could trust to have my back when things got hard. The weeks after that birthday dinner brought changes I didn't expect. I started noticing things I used to ignore, like when a guy in my study group made weird comments about women's bodies, or when someone tried to make me feel bad for setting boundaries. My therapist gave me a whole list of manipulation red flags to watch for, and I realized Chuck had done almost every single one. Love bombing, isolation tactics, gaslighting, triangulation, all of it. I stopped dismissing my gut feelings just because someone seemed nice on the surface. The experience sucked, but it taught me to pay attention when something felt wrong instead of talking myself out of my own instincts. Leanna and Danielle started hanging out with our group pretty regularly after everything came out. Last Friday, we all met up at this coffee shop near campus, and Danielle made a joke about how we should start an official support group for survivors of Chuck's manipulation. We could have matching t-shirts and everything. Everyone laughed, but honestly it felt good to be connected with people who understood what we'd been through. They got it in a way that even my closest friends couldn't fully grasp. Nova invited them to her place for movie night next week, and it felt natural, like they'd always been part of our circle. 6 weeks after the initial incident, I was walking across campus to my morning class when I saw Chuck coming from the opposite direction. My stomach dropped for a second out of habit. But then he looked up, saw me, and immediately looked away. He actually changed direction to avoid walking past me. I kept going straight and realized I wasn't scared of him anymore. He had no power over me or my friends now. Everyone knew what he'd done, and his whole manipulation game was completely destroyed. He couldn't twist stories or make people doubt themselves when we'd all compared notes and exposed his pattern. I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying around this weight and didn't even know it until it was gone. Yesterday, Emily and I were sitting in her apartment looking at weekend trip options for next month. Just us, celebrating our friendship, surviving Chuck's attempts to destroy it. She found this cabin rental near a lake about 2 hours away, and we started planning hiking trails and what snacks to bring. I felt grateful we'd trusted each other enough to compare notes instead of letting his lies win. We could have easily turned on each other like he wanted, but we chose communication instead. Now I have friendships built on real trust and honesty, rather than the drama and games some people try to create. Emily looked up from her laptop and said she was glad I'd screenshotted that first disgusting message because it started the whole chain of us figuring out the truth. I agreed, and we went back to planning our trip, excited about having a whole weekend just us without any manipulation or lies or someone trying to come between us.